Hello students, and welcome to 2404 Survey of Human Anatomy and Physiology, and we're looking at Chapter 15, the Digestive System, Part 1. Functions of the digestive system. It receives food. It breaks down food from complex molecules into simpler ones because our systems cannot handle the complex molecules, so they have to be broken down into simpler ones that our bodies can absorb. Carries on absorption, eliminates unused residues. The parts of the organ system. The accessory organs include the salivary glands, which secrete saliva, which contains enzymes that initiate the breakdown of carbohydrates. The enzyme amylase is the first enzyme encountered here, and it is released by the salivary glands, also known as parotid glands. The mouth is responsible for the tearing down and breaking of the food into smaller particles, and we're going to look at these different parts as we go along here. But the accessory organs along the mouth area, the alimentary canal is the esophagus down to the stomach and through the intestines, and we're going to break this down even further. Okay, so starts out with the mouth and goes to the pharynx, and the pharynx is broken down into two parts, and we'll go over that in just a minute. And we already looked at the trachea. Now let's look at the esophagus. The esophagus carries food down to the stomach, and the liver releases enzymes that aid in digestion in the stomach, and then the gallbladder stores bile and introduces it into the small intestines. Stomach has two layers of smooth muscles that help to churn the food, and we're going to look at that again in just a minute. The pancreas produces and secretes pancreatic juice containing more digestive enzymes and bicarbonate ions, and dumps those into the small intestines and that aid in the digestion of complex molecules or foods into more simpler ones. Small intestines responsible for mixing food with bile and pancreatic juice, and more enzymatic breakdown of food molecules into usable ones. Large intestines mainly absorbs water and electrolytes and forms feces to get rid of the unused elements of that food that you took in, and eliminates them as feces through the anus. Digestion basics. You have chemical versus physical digestion. The physical digestion changes the shape and consistency of the food. It helps to rip, and with your teeth, it helps to rip and tear apart the food to start the breakdown of the larger particles into smaller ones. Then you have chemical digestion. You have several enzymes that are responsible for breaking the food down even further into subunits by adding water. And anytime you add water, hydro means water, and to lyse, you've seen that before, is to break apart. So by adding water, it helps to break apart these larger molecules by a process called hydrolysis. The carbohydrates are more complex. They're broken into monosaccharides. Carbohydrates would be your disaccharides and your polysaccharides. Di meaning two, sugar, saccharides. Poly, many saccharides, into monosaccharides. This is the only way we can use those sugars. are the very simple monosaccharides. We can't use disaccharides and polysaccharides. They have to be broken down into monosaccharides before we can use them as nutrition. It helps to break down fats with down into fatty acids and glycerol. Those are the components that make up fats. We've got to break them down. Proteins, we can't use the proteins directly. The proteins must be broken down into their parts, and we've heard this before, that proteins are made up of amino acids. So the proteins are broken down into polypeptides and then dipeptides. Poly would be many amino acids, polypeptides, and then dipeptides, 2 amino acids, all the way down to the individual amino acids, so that later on we can build proteins and other substances from those amino acids. Very important, we need the individual amino acids, and that comes from the proteins we eat. Nucleic acids for genetic materials help to build genetic materials, so it's broken down into nucleotides, so nucleotides can form more nucleic acids in another process. And then there is absorption. It moves through the intestinal wall so that it can go to where it is needed. That digested nutrients, those broken down nutrients, into their subunits so that we can absorb them and use them. The structure of the wall of the digestive tract, you have a mucosal layer. That's the innermost layer. Now remember that we said this in the last chapter when we were looking at blood vessels, that the opening of that tube, that hollow tube, that opening is called a lumen. Here's that word again. So the mucosa is the innermost layer with the lumen in the middle where the food passes. It carries on the absorption. It contains different glands, globular glands. The submucosa contains blood vessels. It carries absorbs food particles away, but it can only carry those minute parts, the monosaccharides, the fatty acids and the glycerol, the amino acids and the nucleotides, the smaller particles. The muscular layers are 2 layers that alternately contract and relax, and we'll look at that again in just a minute. They're smooth layers. They are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, so we don't have to think about digestion. It happens, regulated by the autonomic nervous system. And then you have the serosa, which is made up of that visceral peritoneum, and you've seen this before. That's that serous membrane that lines the digestive tract. Since it's lining the organ itself, it's the visceral peritoneum. It's the membrane on the exterior of the digestive organs. Okay, this is found on page, I believe, 414 in your textbook, but here we have there's the mucosa, here's the lumen, and lining that luma is that circular fold with the mucosa, and then the next layer, the submucosa, and then 2 layers of the muscles. There's a circular muscle and a longitudinal muscle. Now, why would you have circular muscles than longitudinal muscles? Well, you know that in the digestive tract, in the stomach in particular, that has these 2 layers of muscles, you have peristalsis, which helps to stretch and then contract that stomach to churn that food, and we call that peristalsis. And also this circular and longitudinal muscle contract. After this one contracts, it will relax, and that initiates the other set of muscles to contract. While one set is relaxed, the other set is going to be contracted. So this action, called peristalsis, helps to move that food along that digestive tract. In that mucosa, we're going to have microvilli, these finger-like projections found in the digestive tract. And this villi with microvilli increases surface area, so you can have more substances absorbed. Anytime you have increased surface area, it's going to allow for more absorption. Goblet cells are responsible for producing mucus found in that mucosa. Okay, and here's those finger-like projections. The villi covered by what we call simple columnar epithelium. They are column or rectangular shaped epithelial cells, and between those epithelial cells will be the goblet cells that produce the mucus. And with the shape of these cells and the microvilli on top of the villi, this whole structure, all these are known as villus, and one villi would be plural, villus would be one. Finger-like projection in the intestines, the small intestines, that help to increase surface area for more absorption. Okay, and then we have the lacteal, and we'll discuss these a little bit more later on. Okay, a lymph nodule there, and an intestinal gland, and then you have the nerve plexus, and then you have another 2 layers of muscles here, another mucus gland here. You have circular muscle, and then you have the longitudinal muscles. These make up the structure of the wall. And how does digestion move things along the tube? It helps to mix and move the substances throughout the digestive tract by a process called peristalsis that I just mentioned. And the alternating contractions of those 2 layers of muscles, one runs this way and the other runs this way, and of that stomach, it's smooth muscle, and so when this longitudinal muscle contracts, it shortens that stomach, and then it will relax, and the stomach will stretch out again as this and this layer, this diagonal layer, or run the circumference of this organ, will contract, and it lengthens this, and they alternate, and that helps to churn that chyme, or that mixture of fluids and food in the stomach for peristalsis. Then that helps to move it into the digestive tract. So you have a wave of contraction. This is called peristalsis, the alternating of the smooth muscles all along that tract, called, it happens with what is called segmentation. And you could think of segmentation. It pushes as this contracts and then relaxes the circumference, the layer surrounding this, and then the longitudinal layer, as the layer on the circumference contracts and the longitudinal layer relaxes, and then the longitudinal layer contracts as the circumference layer relaxes, and peristalsis happens. It's called segmentation. So you can sort of think of it as 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So it moves along, but at a little bit back, and a little further this way, and a little bit back, and a little further this way, a little bit back, by the action of those muscles in peristalsis. The control of digestion is mainly hormones. Remember, there are two main controls of almost everything that happens in your body, and that's hormones and the central nervous system. Here you go. Hormones control the release of digestive enzymes. Then you have nervous control. You have parasympathetic impulses, increases activity of the digestive system, and the sympathetic impulses inhibit certain digestive actions. As we said before, remember, sympathetic is fight or flight. So during fight or flight, sympathetic impulses will inhibit digestion because we need the blood supply and we need activity elsewhere to help you with muscle strength and blood supply to the muscles, to the lung, to the tissues that are helping you get out of trouble or in stressful situations. So in sympathetic responses means that digestive actions are going to be inhibited. In parasympathetic, it's going to increase the activity. So you have nervous control and you have hormonal control. Okay, the mouth, where you introduce the food. You receive the food and it begins the preparation of digestion by the ripping and tearing of the food and breaking it down into smaller parts and physical digestion. Then you have amylase added to break down those carbohydrates, and this is where the breakdown of carbohydrates begin, is in the mouth. The other types of foods are broken down elsewhere, and that amylase is the enzyme. ASE ending indicates that it is an enzyme in the saliva. You have the lips here. The hard palate is the bone there. The soft palate is this area with the soft tissue with uvula, and the tonsils, the tongue. The linguingual frenella is that tissue that if you raise your tongue, that will be perpendicular to the tongue. The vestibule and the lower lip. You have the lips with the cheeks, and see the fatty tissue here. On the tongue you have papillae, and lining the papillae are like undulated, and lining the valleys of the papillae are taste buds. They look like sectioned onions. You have the hard palate, the bone part, and then the soft palate is in this area here, the soft part with the uvula. Let's go back here and go over the part. Let's go over the parts of the mouth. You have the frontal sinus and the sphenoidal sinus. Doesn't really have a whole lot to do with digestion, so let's ignore that. The nasal cavity helps you to introduce air as you're swallowing in stuff, but basically doesn't have a whole lot to do with digestion. Here's the tongue and the lip, the hyoid bone, the opening of the auditory tube, the soft palate again, the nasopharynx. So you have the pharynx. This whole area is called the pharynx, and it's broken down into two parts. The upper part, closer to where the nose, the tissue of the nose is called the nasal pharynx. Down here, closer to the mouth and the throat, would be the oral pharynx. The uvula, if you look into the mouth, you'll see that hanging down. Right around on either side, you'll see the palatine tonsils, the oral pharynx here, the lingual tonsil, which is hard for us to see when we're looking in our mouth. Okay, the epiglottis closes off because, okay, remember this tube is the trachea, and so the epiglottis is a fold of tissue that will fold down when you swallow, and that prevents the food from going down the trachea and sends it down the esophagus. The teeth helps to function to break food into smaller parts. There are 2 sets, 20 primary and 32 permanent. You have incisors, 8 incisors, and then you have cuspids. Okay, 4 cuspids, there's 2, and then there's 2. 8 bicuspids, here's the bicuspids, there's 2, 4, 6, 8, and then the 12 molars, 3, 3, 3, 3. The enamel is the outermost layer of the crown of the tooth. The pulp is where you have nerve fibers, blood vessels. The gingiva is the gum that holds that tooth into place. For a person with gingivitis, is irritation of that gingiva, and severe gingivitis will cause a gap here and cause that tooth to get loose and food particles to get down here and cause problems. There's the root canal with the pulp cavity. Periodontal ligament helps to hold it into place. The cementum helps to hold it into place and the hard part of that tooth. And this is the root. So root canal basically takes out the pulp cavity and the nerves and everything from that tooth, and that tooth will basically be non-living anymore after a root canal. So enamel, dentin, pulp, and the parts of crown and the root. The crown, the upper part that shows, and then below the gums would be the root. This is the dentin. Once you get deep into that enamel, if the enamel gets thin, this dentin is exposed to the nerve, so hot and cold and sweet and sometimes sour can cause pain to this tooth. Okay, you have the parotid gland that is anterior to the ear here, with this duct that dumps into the mouth and producing amylase, beginning the breakdown of carbohydrates. Then you have the sublingual gland under the tongue with these ducts here with tiny minute openings in the base of the mouth that help to introduce this amylase. The saliva and amylase, and also the submandibular. The mandible is the bone of the lower jaw. The submandibular gland is another salivary gland that dumps in saliva to help to break down carbohydrates in the mouth. Now you have more complex carbohydrates, and again I said they needed to be monosaccharides, so the polysaccharides are more complex, like the starches, and glycogen, which is a part of meat, is a carbohydrate found in meat. And then you have disaccharides of maltose and sucrose and lactose in milk, sucrose, table sugar, and you'd find that in candy bars and such. And then those would be broken down into monosaccharides such as glucose and fructose, and we can use glucose and fructose in our metabolic processes. The pharynx is a passageway in the back of the throat. Again, I believe we've already gone through some of this, but let's go over it again. The hard palate and then the soft palate. The vestibule, here's the lip, and this is just the little area between the lip and the teeth, the jaw and the teeth, the gums. Okay, and then the tongue. On the soft palate, as this protrudes downward from the back of the mouth, you can see the uvula is part of the soft palate, hard palate being of bone, soft palate. Okay, and then here's the mouth, And either side of this uvula you would find the palatine tonsils, and as you say ah and have your mouth open, that's what the doctor's looking at, or your mom, to check to see if you have inflamed tonsils or a red throat. The lingual tonsils are a little harder to see unless you get a tongue depressor and press down that tongue, and they're still hard to see. But anyway, the pharynx is this area, the back of the throat. Okay, so this is the opening of the auditory tube. Let me just say something about that. That's to the auditory canal. We talked about that when we were talking about the ear. And when you swallow, it helps to equalize pressure on in the pharynx and the ear auditory canal, so it helps to equalize pressure on either side. But anyway, this upper section is the nasopharynx. This whole thing's the pharynx, but it's divided into two parts. The upper section closest to the nose, the nasal cavity, would be the nasopharynx, and then the oral pharynx is the back of the throat. Okay, and then the epiglottis will close off. The trachea is the air passageway to the lungs. We do not need our food going down the trachea, so the epiglottis will close as we are swallowing, and it closes the trachea off and allows the food to go down the esophagus. That's why when you're laughing and cutting up while you're eating, and you get food down the windpipe, then it can be very serious. Okay, so the epiglottis, flap of tissue that closes the windpipe off and allows you to swallow and the food to go down the esophagus. Swallowing mechanism, stage 1. You have food that's chewed, broken down, ripped apart by the teeth, and a bolus is formed mixed with that saliva. A ball of food mixed with saliva, the fluids, is called a bolus. And stage 2 is the swallowing reflex. The soft palate is raised, the larynx or voice box is elevated, the epiglottis seals off the glottis, which is the opening to the windpipe. The tongue is pressed against the soft palate to push that food backwards, that bolus back into the pharynx. The open of the esophagus becomes larger. In stage 3, the food enters the esophagus and it is transported to the stomach by peristalsis. Okay, the swallowing mechanism again. Here you have this bolus, and the tongue rises and pushes that bolus back toward the pharynx. The nasal pharynx is a little higher toward the oral pharynx, and the tongue forces the food into the pharynx. The soft palate, hyoid bone, and larynx are raised, then the tongue is pressed against the palate and the epiglottis closes, blocking off the windpipe so it doesn't go down the trachea instead of the esophagus. The inferior constrictor muscles relax so that the esophagus will be wide open. Superior constrictor muscles contract and forces the food into the esophagus, and then peristalsis begins and pushes that food down that bolus down the esophagus toward the stomach. And again, I said between the alternating of those two smooth muscle layers, three steps forward and 2 steps back. Because of peristalsis, it isn't very conducive to pushing that food along, but you could be standing on your head and still send food toward your stomach. It doesn't help very much, but you could still do it. The esophagus is the tube between the pharynx and the stomach. It has a valve, the lower esophageal sphincter. The lower esophageal sphincter helps to send the food toward the stomach. It's as it goes into the stomach. Okay, esophageal hiatus. And if you've heard of a hiatal hernia, that would be the area of a hiatal hernia. Okay, the gastric glands are scattered throughout the submucosa of the esophagus to produce mucus to add to the moisture in that food and help things move along. And the esophagus is about 25 centimeters long, and remember I said there's like 2.45 centimeters per inch, so that's going to be about 12 inches, about a foot long, a little over a foot long. The valve in the lower esophageal sphincter is as you're getting to the stomach. And the acid, the stomach contents and the acid in the stomach that helps to break down food washes back through that esophageal sphincter, and that's known as heartburn, when it allows the stomach chyme to back up from the stomach into the esophagus. Let's begin looking at the stomach in part 2.